It is 9:47 in the morning for the 27th of January, 1975, and in about 10 minutes, a senator from Idaho is going to sit down at a microphone and force the United States government to admit, under oath, what it did. It poisoned 10,000 of its own citizens. It dosed strangers with LSD in a San Francisco brothel while agents watched through one-way mirrors. And it mailed Martin Luther King Jr. an anonymous letter suggesting he kill himself. His name is Frank Church. He has 11 senators, 150 investigators, and a mandate from the full United States Senate to find out how far it went, not whether it happened. The Senate already knows it happened. The question is how deep. Over the next 14 months, the Church Committee will subpoena tens of thousands of classified documents, call over 800 witnesses, and produce 50,000 pages of reports. And when they're finished, the government will have officially confirmed what it spent decades denying. Not alleged, not speculated. Confirmed under oath and entered into the permanent congressional record that its own intelligence agencies ran secret programs against its own citizens on a scale that made the conspiracy theorists look restrained. Not all conspiracy theories, not fluoride or moon landings or microchips, but a specific, documented, sometimes decades-long set of operations with budget lines, code names, internal memoranda, and body counts. Programs the government denied existed right up until the moment it couldn't deny them anymore. That's what this video is about. We're going to walk through 7 government conspiracies that turned out to be completely, provably, documentably true. Not theories. Not someone who's been on the internet too long. Operations confirmed by congressional investigation, declassified under the Freedom of Information Act, admitted to in federal court, or acknowledged in official government apologies. And we're going to use the government's own words to do it. Because the strangest part of these stories is not that they happened. The strangest part is that the people who ran them wrote everything down. In triplicate, on official letterhead, with carbon copies filed in cabinets that nobody bothered to shred until it was too late. Settle in. Get comfortable. Dim that screen. If you fall asleep before the end, that's fine, that's what we're here for. But I suspect some of these are going to keep you awake a little longer than usual. Let's start with the one that ran the longest. In the winter of 1932, a team of doctors and nurses from the United States Public Health Service showed up in Macon County, Alabama. They brought clipboards, medical bags, and a promise. Free health care from the federal government for people who had never seen a doctor in their lives. Macon County was one of the poorest places in the country. The median income for a black family was roughly $120 a year, not a month, a year. Most people worked as sharecroppers on land they didn't own, growing cotton for prices they didn't set, paying debts they could never fully clear. And the syphilis rate among adult black men in the county was running at about 35%, according to surveys from the late 1920s. The Public Health Service had chosen this place for exactly those reasons: poor, black, rural, sick, and trusting, especially trusting of anyone who showed up from Washington with a white coat and a clipboard promising that help had finally arrived. The study's official title was The Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. That title contains the key word, and it's the one the men who enrolled were never told: untreated. The purpose of the study was not to cure syphilis. It was to watch what happened when you didn't cure it. To document, year by year, decade by decade, the full natural course of the disease as it moved through the human body, the infection, the secondary rashes, the latent period that can stretch for years or even decades, and then the tertiary stage when syphilis attacks the cardiovascular system, the nervous system, the bones, and the brain. You're probably already uncomfortable. Good, you should be. The researchers recruited 399 men who already had syphilis and 201 who didn't. The control group was included so the researchers could compare outcomes between infected and uninfected men, standard experimental design, applied to a profoundly non-standard purpose. All 600 men were told they were receiving free treatment for bad blood, a vague term in the rural South that could mean anything from anemia to fatigue to just not feeling right. It was vague enough to mean whatever the listener needed it to mean, and the researchers used that vagueness deliberately. James H. Jones documented the full scope of this deception in Bad Blood, his 1,981 history of the study still, the definitive account. What the men actually received was aspirin, vitamins, something the researchers called pink medicine, which was nothing, a placebo, with no therapeutic value whatsoever. And they received spinal taps, painful procedures where a needle goes into the spinal canal to withdraw cerebrospinal fluid. The spinal taps weren't treatment, they were data collection. The researchers wanted to test the fluid for signs of neurosyphilis, syphilis that had invaded the nervous system, but the men were told the spinal taps were a special form of therapy. A letter from Nurse Eunice Rivers, the study's primary field worker, the person who maintained these men's trust across decades, described the procedure as a special, free treatment. Special, free, treatment. 3 words that meant the exact opposite of what they said. And here's the detail that moves this from merely unethical to something else entirely. The United States Public Health Service offered to pay for each man's funeral. $50 initially, later reduced to $35. One condition: the families had to agree to autopsies after death. The researchers wanted to see what syphilis had done to the organs after years or decades of running unchecked through a human body. Death wasn't an unfortunate side effect of the study. Death was the conclusion. The autopsies were the point. Everything else, the fake treatment, the vitamins, the reassuring visits from Nurse Rivers, was just the wait. Now, in 1932, you could construct an argument, a morally troubled argument, but an argument that the existing treatments for syphilis were themselves toxic and unreliable. Arsenic-based compounds like salvarsan and its derivative neosalvarsan, months of painful injections, partial effectiveness at best. If you were a researcher in 1932, you might convince yourself that observing the disease's natural course in patients with no access to effective treatment could generate knowledge that would help develop something better. You might convince yourself, and that's exactly what they did. That argument collapses entirely in 1947, because that's when penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis. Cheap, widely available, effective. A simple course of intramuscular injections administered over 1 to 3 weeks. By 1950, every public health authority in the United States recognized penicillin as the definitive treatment. Every public health authority except the team running the Tuskegee study. The participants could have been cured. A few weeks of penicillin would have stopped the disease in every man whose syphilis hadn't yet reached the irreversible tertiary stage. The researchers knew this. They discussed it internally. They weighed the scientific value of continuing the study against the lives of the men enrolled in it. The science won, but it was worse than simply withholding treatment. They actively made sure nobody else treated the men either. When Macon County's health department opened a syphilis treatment clinic in the 1940s, a clinic any resident could walk into and receive penicillin, the PHS researchers sent the health department a list of names, the names of the study participants, and they asked that those specific men be excluded from treatment. The health department complied. When some of the men were drafted during World War II and received mandatory syphilis screening at their military induction physicals, the researchers contacted the draft boards and arranged for those men to be excluded from treatment as well. Let that sit for a second. The United States Army was going to cure these men as a routine part of putting them in uniform, and the United States Public Health Service, a different arm of the same government, intervened to stop it, because curing them would have ruined the data. Susan Reverby explored the institutional thinking behind these decisions in examining Tuskegee, her 2009 study of the experiment and its legacy. What she found wasn't a conspiracy of villains twirling their mustaches in a dark room. It was something more ordinary, and in some ways, more disturbing. A bureaucracy that had simply decided the data was more important than the men producing it. Nobody had to be evil. They just had to believe in the research. And if you think that kind of thinking is safely in the past, well, we'll get there. Dr. John Heller, who directed the Division of Venereal Diseases at the Public Health Service during the 1950s and 1960s, offered a retrospective justification that has become one of the most quoted lines in the entire history of medical ethics. His words: "The men's status did not warrant ethical debate. They were subjects, not patients. Clinical material, not people. Clinical material, not patients, not citizens, not human beings, with families and children and names their neighbors knew. Clinical material." And that designation held, unchallenged from within, for 40 years. The study didn't end because someone inside the system developed a conscience. There were opportunities. It was reviewed internally at least 7 times over its lifespan. In 1969, 22 years after penicillin became the standard cure, the Centers for Disease Control convened a formal review panel that included public health officials and outside physicians. The panel voted unanimously to continue the study. Unanimously, in 1969. The institutional consensus was that the study should proceed to what the researchers called its natural endpoint, which was the death and autopsy of every single participant. The study ended because one person outside the system decided to talk. Peter Buxton was 28 years old, a former psychiatric social worker who had recently joined the PHS venereal disease program. In 1966, he learned about the study through internal channels. He was appalled. He filed a formal ethical protest with his superiors. They told him the study would continue. He filed a second protest in 1968. Same answer. The 1,969 review panel examined his concerns specifically and voted unanimously to keep going. His objections had been noted, considered, and overruled by the full weight of institutional consensus. So, in 1972, 6 years after his first complaint produced no change, Peter Buxton went to the press. He contacted Jean Heller, a reporter at the Associated Press. On the 25th of July, 1972, the story ran on the front page of newspapers across the country. Within 24 hours, the Assistant Secretary for Health terminated the study, not because an ethics board caught it, not because a congressional committee discovered it, because a journalist published it and the government couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore. The aftermath was extensive and profoundly insufficient. By the time the study ended, at least 128 participants had died of syphilis or its direct complications. 40 of their wives had contracted syphilis through sexual transmission. Women who were never enrolled in the study, never consented to anything, never told that their husbands carried a curable disease. 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis, a condition that causes bone deformities, deafness, and neurological damage. A class action lawsuit produced a $10 million out-of-court settlement in 1974. Congress passed the National Research Act of 1974, which created the Institutional Review Board system that governs human subject research in this country to this day. So, if you've ever signed an informed consent form before a medical procedure and wondered why it was so long and so detailed, now you know. Tuskegee is why. And in 1997, 65 years after the study began, President Bill Clinton stood in the East Room of the White House and said the words, "The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It was an outrage to our commitment to integrity and equality for all our citizens." 5 of the original participants were still alive to hear it. Herman Shaw, 94 years old, stood in the East Room and shook the president's hand. He'd been enrolled as a young man in 1932. He'd been told he was being treated for bad blood. He hadn't been treated for anything. And it took 65 years for the government to stand in front of him and say the word sorry. The Tuskegee study was not a conspiracy theory. It was a government program with a budget line, an institutional chain of command, peer-reviewed publications in medical journals that anyone could read, and 4 decades of paperwork filed in triplicate. It was called a conspiracy theory by people who didn't want to believe their government was capable of it. It was also not the only one. The Tuskegee study proved the government was willing to watch its own citizens die for the sake of data, but watching wasn't enough for the CIA. The next program proved they were willing to create the suffering themselves in hospitals, in prisons, and in a brothel on a hill in San Francisco, where federal agents watched through one-way mirrors while strangers lost their minds. On the 13th of April, 1953, Allen Dulles, the director of Central Intelligence, a man who wore 3-piece suits and wire-rimmed glasses and looked more like a small-town banker than the head of America's spy agency, signed off on a program with the internal designation MKUltra. The program's stated goal, in the language of its own authorization memo, was to investigate the use of biological and chemical materials in altering human behavior. That phrase covered an extraordinary range of activities, which is the CIA's way of saying it covered things you are not going to believe actually happened inside a government program. The CIA's own Inspector General confirmed the scope in a 1963 internal report that was declassified in 1977. Over the next 20 years, MKUltra would grow to encompass 149 documented subprojects, conducted at more than 80 institutions, 44 colleges and universities, 12 hospitals, 3 prisons, several pharmaceutical companies. The annual budget, at its peak in the mid-1950s, ran to roughly $25 million in today's dollars. And the whole thing operated under what the CIA internally called extreme compartmentalization, which is a fancy way of saying they made sure the left hand didn't know what the right hand was dosing with LSD. Most of the researchers conducting the experiments didn't even know they were working for the CIA. Their funding came through front organizations with names designed to sound respectable: the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, and several others the CIA had either created from scratch or quietly infiltrated through covert agreements with their boards. Many of the test subjects didn't know they were being experimented on at all. And this is where MKUltra leaves the category of merely troubling government overreach and enters territory that sounds like someone made it up for a spy novel. Except they didn't. The program breaks into roughly 4 categories, and any single one of them would be independently scandalous if it stood alone. The first was drugging people who had absolutely no idea they were being drugged. The CIA administered LSD lysergic acid diethylamide, a powerful hallucinogenic compound that had only been synthesized for the first time in 1938 to hundreds of Americans without their knowledge or consent. Some were CIA employees being tested for loyalty. Some were military personnel told they were participating in ordinary medical screenings. Some were hospital patients who received LSD in place of, or in addition to, their prescribed medications. And some were just random people who had the bad luck to walk into the wrong bar on the wrong night. The most infamous subproject was Operation Midnight Climax. And I need you to understand that the following sentences describe real events documented in congressional testimony, not a spy thriller that got rejected by the publisher for being too ridiculous. CIA operatives hired sex workers to lure men from bars and nightclubs to safe houses in San Francisco and New York City. The men's drinks were dosed with LSD. And CIA officers stationed behind one-way mirrors in adjacent rooms watched and documented the men's behavior as the drug took effect. This was not a handful of incidents conducted over a few weeks. Midnight Climax ran continuously from 1954 to 1963, nearly a decade of government-funded psychedelic brothel surveillance. The program's field officer was a narcotics agent named George Hunter White, who kept a diary that was later recovered and entered into evidence during the Church Committee hearings. John Marks quoted it in The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, his 1979 investigation of MKUltra, still the definitive account. One entry read, "I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? Fun, fun, fun." That's a direct quote from a government employee describing a government program that dosed unsuspecting American citizens with hallucinogenic drugs in a government-funded brothel. Your tax dollars at work? The second category was what happened at the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Montreal. A Scottish-born psychiatrist named Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, funded by the CIA through one of those front organizations, conducted experiments that his own colleagues would later describe, without hesitation or qualification, as torture. Cameron was not some fringe figure operating out of a basement lab. He was the president of the American Psychiatric Association, the founding chairman of the World Psychiatric Association. He had testified at the Nuremberg trials as an expert on the psychology of Nazi defendants. By every conventional professional measure, one of the most respected psychiatrists on the planet. And he was doing to his own patients exactly the kind of thing he'd condemned the Nazis for doing at Nuremberg. The irony would be poetic if it weren't so grotesque. Cameron's technique, which he called psychic driving, worked in 3 phases. First, he placed patients into medically induced comas for periods ranging from several days to several weeks, using massive doses of barbiturates and chlorpromazine. Second, while the patients were unconscious, he played recorded messages through speakers mounted under their pillows, the same phrase, repeated over and over, up to 250,000 times across several weeks. Third, he administered electroconvulsive therapy at 30 to 40 times the standard clinical dosage. Not one treatment every few days, which was the accepted norm, 6 to 12 treatments per day. The Senate joint hearing on MKUltra in August 1977 heard testimony from Cameron's McGill colleagues describing these protocols and their devastating consequences. Most of Cameron's patients had walked into the Allen Memorial Institute on their own. Postpartum depression, anxiety, marriage problems, routine stuff. They walked out, unable to recognize their own children. Some couldn't read. Some couldn't dress themselves. Some had to be taught how to use a telephone again, at ages when they'd been using telephones for 20 years. Cameron didn't treat their depression, he erased their lives. Linda McDonald entered the institute in 1963 for treatment of moderate depression. She was 26 years old. Over the course of 86 days, she received 102 electroshock treatments and was placed in a drug-induced coma for most of that period. When she was released, she couldn't read, couldn't write, didn't recognize her husband or her 5 children. She had to be toilet trained again at 26 because Cameron's treatment had wiped out her procedural memory along with everything else. Harvey Weinstein, the psychiatrist, not the film producer, documented cases like McDonald's in psychiatry and the CIA, his 1,990 study of the program's victims. A Canadian government inquiry eventually compensated 77 of Cameron's patients, acknowledging that the experiments constituted a fundamental violation of medical ethics and human rights. 77 compensated patients. Out of how many total? Nobody knows for sure. Cameron's records were incomplete even before the CIA started destroying things. If you walked into a Canadian psychiatric hospital in the 1950s for anxiety, there was a chance you'd walk out unable to remember your own name, and nobody would have told you why. The third category involved testing biological and chemical agents on entire cities full of people who had no idea anything was happening. In September 1953, years before MKUltra was formally authorized, during a precursor program, the U.S. Navy sprayed the bacterium Serratia marcescens over San Francisco from offshore vessels using giant hoses mounted on ship decks. The operation was codenamed Sea Spray, and its purpose was to test how vulnerable a major American city would be to a biological weapons attack. The bacteria was considered harmless at the time. It wasn't entirely harmless. Hospitals in the Bay Area reported a significant spike in urinary tract infections in the weeks following the spraying. At least one person died. Edward Nevin, a pipe fitter recovering from routine prostate surgery at Stanford Hospital, who contracted a Serratia infection that his physicians had no way to explain at the time. His family didn't learn the real cause for 25 years. Leonard Cole documented the full scope of the testing program in Clouds of Secrecy, his 1,988 study of the Army's germ warfare tests over populated areas. San Francisco wasn't the only city. Between 1,950 and 1,969, the Army conducted 239 open-air biological weapons tests over populated areas across the country: New York, Washington, Minneapolis, St. Louis, and dozens of smaller cities. Bacteria released from aircraft, ships, vehicles, and portable generators. The residents of these cities were not informed. They were not asked for consent. In the government's own operational language, they were test subjects in the field. Test subjects in the field, meaning in their homes, at their jobs, walking their kids to school, breathing. And the fourth category was the cover-up, which honestly might be the most revealing part of the whole story because it shows you what the CIA thought the evidence was worth. In January 1973, the same year the Watergate scandal was consuming the Nixon White House, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. The order was carried out. 20 years of experimental records, subject files, project authorizations, and correspondence were shredded. The program would have remained permanently secret, not declassified after 50 years, not gradually revealed through FOIA requests, but permanently and irreversibly destroyed, if not for a single bureaucratic accident. A set of financial records, budgets, expenditure reports, reimbursement forms had been misfiled in a different building from the operational files. They sat in boxes in a record storage facility that wasn't included in the destruction order because nobody knew the boxes were there. They were discovered in 1977 during a routine records search prompted by a Freedom of Information Act request filed by journalist John Marks. The entire reason we know about MKUltra in detail the sub-projects, the institutions, the front organizations, the dollar amounts. The names is because someone put a box of receipts on the wrong shelf in 1973 and nobody noticed for 4 years. If the filing had been competent, the program would have been erased from history. Marx told this story in his author's note to The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. Think about that next time someone tells you the government is too incompetent to keep secrets. They're right, but only because of the filing. The most haunting individual case from MKUltra is the death of Frank Olson. Olson was an Army biochemist who worked at Fort Detrick in Maryland, the military's biological weapons research facility. On the 19th of November, 1953, Olson attended a work retreat at Deep Creek Lodge in western Maryland with colleagues from the CIA's Technical Services Division. During the retreat, his boss, Sidney Gottlieb, who ran MKUltra, slipped LSD into Olson's glass of COINTELPRO without his knowledge. Over the following 9 days, Olson changed. Anxious, paranoid, increasingly agitated. His colleagues observed that he was not himself. He was taken to New York City to see a CIA-connected physician. He was checked into the Statler Hotel Room 1018A under CIA supervision. Early in the morning of the 28th of November, 1953, Frank Olson went through a closed window on the 13th floor and fell to his death. He was 43 years old. He left a wife and 3 children. The CIA told the family he'd suffered a mental breakdown and jumped. They said nothing about the LSD, nothing about MKUltra, nothing about any of it. The family learned the truth 22 years later from the Church Committee. President Ford personally apologized. CIA Director William Colby met with the family and handed them the declassified documents. Congress passed a private bill awarding the family $750,000. But the story didn't end there. In 1994, Frank's eldest son, Eric, who had been 9 years old when his father died, had the body exhumed and examined by Dr. James Starrs, a forensic pathologist at George Washington University. Starrs found a previously undetected cranial fracture on Olson's skull, a fracture consistent with a blow to the head occurring before the fall, not during it. The Manhattan District Attorney opened a homicide investigation. It was never resolved. The CIA has never fully declassified Olson's complete file. Eric Olson spent the rest of his life trying to determine whether his father was murdered by the agency that employed him. He died in 2024, without an answer. If you're keeping score at home, and I recommend you don't, because this list only gets worse, that's a government agency that drugged one of its own scientists, watched him fall apart for 9 days, let him die, lied to his family for 22 years, apologized, paid them off, and then refused to release the file that might explain whether the death was an accident or something else entirely. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a job performance review. 149 subprojects, 80 institutions, hundreds or thousands of subjects who never knew what was done to them. And the only reason any of it came to light was a misfiled box and a journalist who filed the right paperwork. But MKUltra was aimed outward at enemies, at strangers, at people the CIA classified as national security threats. The next program was aimed at Americans who did something the government considered far more dangerous than espionage. They organized, they marched, they registered voters, they asked questions. On the 25th of August 1967, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover sent a memo to every field office in the United States. The subject line read, "Counterintelligence Program Black Nationalist Hate Groups." The Church Committee later published the memo in full in Book 3 of their final report. Its instructions were explicit. The purpose of this new counterintelligence endeavor is to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of Black nationalist, hate-type organizations and groupings, their leadership, spokesmen, membership, and supporters. Note the word, not investigate, not prosecute, not bring to trial, neutralize. The FBI's own vocabulary, written in its own internal memo and distributed to its own field offices, described a mission that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with making certain Americans shut up. The 1967 directive was the formal expansion of a program that had already been running for 11 years. COINTELPRO Counterintelligence program started in 1956, originally as COINTELPRO CPUSA, targeting the Communist Party of the United States. Cold War era, national security rationale. a recognizable, if debatable, connection to foreign intelligence threats. You could at least follow the logic, even if you disagreed with the methods. By 1967, that logic had evaporated. COINTELPRO had expanded to encompass the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the Black Panther Party, the American Indian movement, Students for a Democratic Society, the Women's Liberation Movement, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Puerto Rican Independence Movement, and what the Bureau vaguely termed the New Left. The only common thread among these targets was that J. Edgar Hoover didn't like what they were saying. The word dangerous, as Hoover used it, was doing an extraordinary amount of heavy lifting. The FBI's operational definition of dangerous included people who organized peaceful marches, people who wrote editorials in student newspapers, people who taught university courses the Bureau considered ideologically suspect, people who attended meetings. And it included, by Hoover's explicit and personally directed attention, the most prominent civil rights leader in American history. The FBI first took notice of Martin Luther King Jr. after the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 1956. By 1962, Hoover had designated King as a target for intensive surveillance. By 1963, King was under continuous electronic monitoring wiretaps on his home and office telephones, microphone bugs planted in his hotel rooms when he traveled, and physical surveillance teams tracking his movements across the country. The wiretap authorization came from Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who signed the original order in October 1963. The surveillance was extensive, but the surveillance wasn't the point. The point was what the FBI did with what it heard. In November 1964, 20 days before Martin Luther King Jr. was scheduled to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, William Sullivan, the head of the FBI's Domestic Intelligence Division and Hoover's primary lieutenant on the King operation, sent a package to King's home. Inside was a cassette tape compiled from recordings made during the FBI's surveillance of King's hotel rooms, and an anonymous letter. The letter has been partially declassified. The relevant passage: King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do it. This exact number has been selected for a specific reason. It has definite practical significance. 34 days. The exact number of days remaining before the Nobel ceremony. The package was received by Coretta Scott King, who opened it. Both she and Dr. King understood the letter for what it was: an invitation to kill himself before the prize ceremony, accompanied by surveillance recordings to make sure he understood that they had been listening the entire time. This was not a rogue agent freelancing on his own initiative. William Sullivan reported directly to J. Edgar Hoover. The letter was reviewed and approved at the executive level of the Bureau before it was mailed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the chief law enforcement agency of the United States of America, composed, approved, and sent an anonymous letter to a Nobel Peace Prize laureate urging him to commit suicide. They included the surveillance tape so he'd know they meant it. That's your FBI. In 1964, using money from your taxes, the COINTELPRO operations against the Black Panther Party were more overtly violent. The Church Committee documented a systematic campaign to, and this is the Bureau's own internal language, destroy the Black Panther Party from the inside out. The tactics included infiltration by paid informants, the planting of false evidence, the deliberate creation of internal conflicts through forged letters and anonymous accusations designed to turn members against each other. And in at least one case that has been extensively documented and litigated, direct collaboration with local police in an operation that ended in a killing. Fred Hampton was the chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. He was 21 years old. He had organized a free breakfast program for children on Chicago's West Side that served roughly 5,000 meals a week. He had brokered a truce between two of the city's largest rival street gangs, the Blackstone Rangers and the Vice Lords, convincing them to redirect their energy from territorial violence toward community organizing. And the FBI considered him one of the most dangerous people in the United States. A 21-year-old who fed children breakfast. Dangerous. On the 4th of December 1969, at 4:45 in the morning, a tactical unit of 14 Chicago police officers conducted a predawn raid on Hampton's apartment at 2337 West Monroe Street. They were operating on a detailed floor plan of the apartment provided by FBI informant William O'Neill, who also happened to serve as Hampton's personal bodyguard and the chief of security for the Illinois chapter. The officers fired approximately 90 rounds into the apartment. The occupants fired one, a single shotgun blast from Mark Clark, who was killed in the initial volley while sitting in a chair by the front door. Fred Hampton was shot twice in the head at close range while lying in his bed. Forensic evidence and subsequent investigation established that he was likely unconscious when the shooting began. O'Neill had slipped secobarbital, a powerful barbiturate, into Hampton's drink earlier that evening. The initial police narrative was self-defense. They said Hampton's group had started a firefight and the officers responded proportionally. The physical evidence told a different story. Bullet trajectory analysis, conducted by a federal grand jury, showed that 82 of the 90 rounds had been fired into the apartment by police. One round had been fired by the occupants, Clark's single shotgun blast, which was itself likely a reflexive discharge as he was hit. The angles and entry points made it clear this was not a firefight. It was a one-directional assault on a sleeping household. Jeffrey Haas documented the full investigation in The Assassination of Fred Hampton, his 2010 account of the case, and the 13 years of civil litigation that followed. In 1982, the federal government, the city of Chicago, and Cook County settled a civil rights lawsuit filed by the survivors and Hampton's family for $1.85 million, which, if you're keeping track, works out to less than the cost of a modest house for the premeditated killing of a 21-year-old in his own bed. William O'Neill, the FBI informant who had provided the floor plan, identified the location of Hampton's bed, and drugged Hampton on the night of the raid, received a $300 bonus from the FBI for his work on the Hampton operation. $300 for a floor plan to a killing. He was relocated under a new identity. In January 1990, on the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, O'Neill committed suicide by running into traffic on the Eisenhower Expressway. He had recently learned that his role in Hampton's death was about to become public in a documentary film. $300. Sleep tight with that number. You're welcome for that knowledge, by the way. None of this was in your high school history textbook. It probably should have been. COINTELPRO's full scope went far beyond King and Hampton. The Church Committee documented operations against the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the NAACP, the American Indian Movement, Students for a Democratic Society, the Women's Liberation Movement, and dozens of local community organizations whose only shared characteristic was expressing political views that J. Edgar Hoover considered unacceptable. The Bureau's own declassified files showed that the criteria for targeting an individual or organization had nothing to do with criminal activity and everything to do with political dissent. The Church Committee's final report stated it plainly. Too many people have been spied upon by too many government agencies, and too much information has been collected. The government has often undertaken the secret surveillance of citizens on the basis of their political beliefs, even when those beliefs pose no threat of violence or illegal acts on behalf of a hostile foreign power. The program didn't end because the FBI decided it was wrong. It ended because someone stole the evidence. On March 8, 1971, while most of the country was watching the Muhammad Ali-Joe Frazier heavyweight championship fight on television, a group of activists calling themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into the Bureau's field office in Media, Pennsylvania. They picked the lock on a side door, walked in, and walked out with over 1,000 classified documents. They copied the documents and mailed them to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times. The word COINTELPRO appeared in the files. The public learned a name for what their government had been doing. And Hoover, unable to identify the burglars, unable to recover the documents, unable to stop the press from publishing them, shut the program down. 3 programs so far: Tuskegee, MKUltra, COINTELPRO, and you're probably noticing a pattern. The government runs a secret operation against its own people. The government's own oversight mechanisms fail to catch it, or choose not to look. Someone outside the system breaks the silence: a whistleblower, a journalist, a group of burglars with a conscience, and a set of lockpicks. And the public finds out, years or decades later, what was being done in their name. That pattern holds for the next one too, except this time the secret wasn't what the government was doing to citizens. It was what the government was doing to the truth itself. In October 1977, Carl Bernstein, yes, that Carl Bernstein, one of the two Washington Post reporters who had broken the Watergate story, published a 25,000-word investigation in Rolling Stone magazine. The title was The CIA and the Media. It drew on interviews with more than 200 current and former CIA officers, journalists, and media executives. And its central finding was damning. For more than 25 years, the CIA had maintained a network of American journalists who either worked for the agency or cooperated with it for access, information, or money. The operation has been referred to by historians and journalists as Operation Mockingbird, a name that first appeared in Deborah Davis's 1979 book about the CIA's influence over American media institutions. The metaphor is precise. A mockingbird doesn't compose its own songs. It copies the songs of other birds and reproduces them perfectly. The CIA composed the melody. The journalists performed it. And the audience, the American public, reading their morning paper, watching the evening news, never knew the difference. Bernstein's investigation identified more than 400 American journalists who had maintained some form of relationship with the CIA between 1952 and 1977. The relationships ranged widely in depth and formality. At the shallow end, a journalist might occasionally debrief with a CIA contact after returning from a foreign reporting trip, sharing observations, impressions, and information gathered during interviews that might be useful to intelligence analysts. Journalism and intelligence collection overlap in ways that most people don't think about. Both involve traveling to interesting places, asking probing questions, and trying to figure out what powerful people are actually doing. The shallow end of the network was basically the CIA saying, "Hey, while you were in Cairo, did you notice anything interesting?" And the journalists saying yes. At the deep end were journalists who were, for all practical purposes, intelligence officers operating under press credentials, filing stories that were either written at the CIA's direction or reviewed by the agency before publication. These weren't sources being cultivated. They were assets being deployed. The Church Committee confirmed the broad outlines of Bernstein's reporting. Book 1 of the committee's final report, Foreign and Military Intelligence, documented that the CIA maintained relationships with approximately 50 American journalists or media representatives who were directly employed by or who performed regular assignments for American news organizations. Those 50 were the confirmed core. The broader circle of occasional cooperators, stringers, and contacts numbered in the hundreds. Among the organizations whose employees had documented CIA connections, the New York Times, CBS News, Time Magazine, Newsweek, The Washington Post, the Associated Press, United Press International, Reuters, the Hearst newspaper chain, the Scripps Howard newspaper chain, and the Copley News Service, not marginal outlets, not fringe publications. The institutions that defined American journalism in the post-war era, the CIA's network reached into the editorial backbone of the free press. Frank Wisner, the CIA's director of plans, the division responsible for covert operations worldwide, reportedly described the agency's media network as Wisner's Wurlitzer. Hugh Wilford explored this metaphor in depth in The Mighty Wurlitzer, his 2008 study of how the CIA played America's cultural institutions during the Cold War. A Wurlitzer is a mechanical organ, the kind you'd find in an old movie theater. You press one key, and a whole orchestra of sounds comes out, as if the instrument is playing itself. That was Wisner's vision for the American press. An instrument the CIA could play at will, producing whatever music it wanted from an institution that appeared to be operating independently. If that metaphor makes you uncomfortable, it should. It was designed to. Wisner wasn't embarrassed by it. He was proud. The CIA's use of journalists served 3 strategic purposes, and each one is worth understanding because they show you how the network functioned as a system, not just a collection of individual relationships. First, journalists provided cover for intelligence officers operating abroad. A CIA officer traveling to Moscow or Cairo or Saigon under press credentials could move freely, ask probing questions, attend government press conferences, and cultivate sources in positions of power, and nobody would find it suspicious, because that's exactly what journalists are supposed to do. The cover was nearly perfect. Second, the CIA used its media relationships to plant stories. Specific articles favorable to CIA objectives, supporting a particular foreign policy position, discrediting a government the CIA was working to destabilize, or promoting a narrative that served American strategic interests were either written by CIA-connected journalists or placed through editors who cooperated with the agency. The Church Committee found that the CIA's Directorate of Plans maintained what it called a propaganda assets inventory, a formal, maintained roster of foreign and domestic media assets that could be activated to disseminate specific messages on demand, not a metaphor, a list, with names on it. Third, and this was the dimension that Bernstein emphasized most heavily, the CIA used its media relationships to suppress stories. When a journalist uncovered information that the CIA considered operationally sensitive, the agency could and frequently did intervene to prevent publication. The intervention might be a phone call from a senior CIA official to a publisher. It might be a quiet lunch. Or it might be a formal invocation of national security, backed by the implicit understanding that a journalist who defied the request would find their access to government sources cut off, not just at the CIA, across every department and agency in Washington, everywhere. Think about that for a second. You're a reporter. You've got a story that matters. And someone from Langley calls your boss and says the magic words, national security, and your story disappears. Not because it was wrong, because it was inconvenient. The most extensively documented institutional relationship was between the CIA and CBS News. Sig Mickelson, who served as president of CBS News throughout the 1950s, maintained regular contact with CIA officials. At least 2 senior CBS correspondents served as active CIA assets during parts of their careers. The relationship was not adversarial. It was collaborative, and it lasted for years. In 1973, CIA Director William Colby issued an internal directive formally prohibiting the agency from entering into paid or contractual relationships with full-time accredited American journalists. The directive was issued preemptively before the Church Committee had begun its investigation, which tells you that the CIA's own leadership recognized the media network would not survive public scrutiny. But the directive contained a loophole. It prohibited relationships with accredited journalists, a term that excluded stringers, freelancers, foreign correspondents without formal press credentials, and any journalist willing to describe their relationship with the CIA as voluntary rather than contractual. The Church Committee noted this loophole explicitly and recommended that it be closed. The recommendation was not adopted. You could drive a truck through that loophole, and for all we know, someone did. The lasting damage of Mockingbird isn't any specific story that was planted or killed. Those are historical footnotes whose effects dissipated decades ago. The lasting damage is epistemic. It's damage to the ability of the American public to trust what they read and hear from their own press. The confirmed, documented, admitted existence of a CIA network inside American newsrooms gave future generations a factual basis for doubting the independence of journalism. Not every conspiracy theory about media manipulation is true, but the foundational one, the one that says the CIA literally had reporters on its payroll, was. And that damage runs in both directions. Mockingbird's confirmed existence makes it easier for genuinely independent journalists to be dismissed as government mouthpieces, even when they're not. It makes it harder for the press to serve its essential function as a check on government power, because anyone who knows about Mockingbird, and you should know about it, carries a justified skepticism that is almost impossible to fully satisfy. The CIA created a trust problem that outlived the program by decades. They may have shut down the Wurlitzer, but the audience is still wondering who's really playing the music. The 4 programs we've covered so far, Tuskegee, MKUltra, COINTELPRO, and Mockingbird, were all carried out. They were implemented, they operated for years or decades, and they produced real victims. The next one is different. It was proposed, detailed on paper, and signed by the highest-ranking military officers in the country. But it was never executed. What makes it worth including on this list is not what happened. It's what the people at the top were willing to put in writing. On the 13th of March, 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military body in the United States, submitted a memorandum to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The memo proposed a series of covert operations designed to create a pretext for a full-scale American military invasion of Cuba. It was signed by General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The document was classified top secret, special handling, not for foreign dissemination, It remained classified for 35 years. It was declassified in 1997 as part of a routine records review by the Assassination Records Review Board, a board Congress had created to locate and release classified documents from the Kennedy era. The Northwoods memo had nothing to do with the Kennedy assassination. It surfaced because the review board's mandate was broad enough to catch any classified JCS documents from the period. Nobody was looking for it. It just showed up. James Bamford, the journalist and intelligence historian, brought the Northwoods documents to wide public attention in Body of Secrets, his 2001 investigation of the National Security Agency. The memo's title was Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. Its contents described a menu of possible operations, each designed to look like a hostile act by Cuba against the United States, each designed to generate sufficient public outrage to justify a military response. And each was described in the calm, clinical language of a routine military planning document as if the proposals were standard operational options rather than conspiracies against the American people. I want to walk you through some of these proposals directly, because the specificity is what makes Northwoods significant. These aren't summaries or interpretations. These are operations described in the text of the document itself, filed at the National Archives, available for anyone to read. The memo proposed sinking a U.S. Navy ship in Guantanamo Bay Harbor and blaming it on Cuba. It specified, in writing, that casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. Helpful, their word. Not tragic, not unfortunate, helpful. It proposed staging attacks on the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo, actual attacks, with real explosions, real fires, and real property damage conducted by American military personnel disguised as Cuban agents. It proposed conducting a campaign of terror in Miami and other Florida cities. The memo's exact language: we could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The campaign would include bombs in carefully chosen locations, staged arrests, and fabricated documents substantiating Cuban involvement. It proposed hijacking American civilian aircraft and blaming the hijackings on Cuban agents. And it proposed, in what has become the most widely cited paragraph of the entire document, a plan to replace a real civilian aircraft with a remotely piloted drone. Here's how it would work. A chartered flight carrying college students off on a holiday takes off from a Florida airport. At a rendezvous point over water, the real plane lands at a military airfield. A drone aircraft, identical in appearance, continues on the flight path, broadcasting a pre-recorded distress signal. Over Cuban waters, the drone gets destroyed by remote signal. Fake passenger manifests go to the press. Cuba gets blamed. Invasion justified. This was not a Hollywood screenplay. This was not a novel. This was a formal proposal from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the Secretary of Defense, written on Department of Defense letterhead, signed by the chairman, and transmitted through official channels. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The highest-ranking military officers in the country sat in a room, discussed bombing American cities and faking airplane crashes, wrote it all down in a memo, and sent it up the chain, expecting someone to say yes. That's not a conspiracy theory about what the government might do. That's a document about what the government's most senior military leaders wanted to do. The only reason it didn't happen is that the civilians said no. To understand how this document could exist, you need the context. In March 1962, the Kennedy administration was 18 months past the Bay of Pigs. The botched, CIA-backed invasion of Cuba in April 1961 that had humiliated the administration and strengthened Castro's position. The Joint Chiefs had been furious about the Bay of Pigs. They believed Kennedy had lost his nerve by refusing to provide air support, and they were under active pressure from the administration through a covert program called Operation Mongoose, overseen by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to produce options for removing Castro from power. Northwoods was their answer, not an aberration, a response to a question they had been asked. McNamara rejected the proposal, Kennedy rejected it. Lemnitzer was not reappointed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs when his term expired later that year, reassigned to NATO, which some historians read as a quiet removal and others as routine rotation. Kennedy reportedly told an aide that the Joint Chiefs were out of their minds, which, based on what you just heard, seems like a reasonable assessment. But the proposal existed, it was written, it was signed, it was submitted through official channels, and it remained classified for 35 years. For an entire generation, anyone who suggested that senior American military leaders had once proposed staging terrorist attacks against American civilians to manufacture a justification for war would have been dismissed reasonably, based on the available evidence, as a conspiracy theorist. The actual evidence was sitting in a classified filing cabinet at the National Archives, waiting for a routine records review to release it into the public record. Northwoods was never carried out. That is the crucial distinction between it and the other programs on this list. It was proposed and rejected. But its existence proves something that is, in some ways, more unsettling than any program that was actually implemented. The people at the top of the military chain of command were willing to propose it. They thought about it, they detailed it, they signed their names to it, and they expected to be taken seriously. The next story doesn't involve a proposal that was rejected. It involves a lie that was accepted. A lie that started a war and killed millions. On the night of the 4th of August, 1964, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy were conducting signals intelligence operations in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. At approximately 9:30 p.m. local time, the ship's crews reported that they were under attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Sailors on watch reported seeing torpedo wakes in the water. Sonar operators reported high-speed propeller contacts. The ships maneuvered evasively and opened fire into the darkness. President Lyndon Johnson went on national television the following evening and announced that American naval forces had been subjected to deliberate and unprovoked attacks in international waters. On the 7th of August, 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution by a vote of 416 to 0 inches in the House and 88 to 2 inches the Senate. The resolution authorized the president to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. It was the legal basis for the Vietnam War. There is one problem with the August 4 attack. It almost certainly did not happen. But before you can understand why the August 4 incident matters, you need to know what the USS Maddox was actually doing in the Gulf of Tonkin, because the word unprovoked, as Johnson used it on national television, was doing a tremendous amount of work. The Maddox was not on a routine patrol. It was conducting a DeSoto mission, a classified signals intelligence operation that involved sailing close to the North Vietnamese coastline to intercept military communications and map radar installations. At the same time, a separate covert program called Oplan 34A was sending South Vietnamese commandos trained, equipped, and directed by the CIA to conduct sabotage raids against North Vietnamese coastal targets. The DeSoto patrols and the Oplan 34. Raids were coordinated, though the official position was that they were independent operations. In other words, the United States was simultaneously running covert military attacks against North Vietnam and sailing a spy ship along its coast. When Johnson described the situation as unprovoked, that word was carrying a lot more weight than the American public knew, and a lot more weight than you were taught in school, assuming your school mentioned Tonkin at all. The first incident on the 2nd of August 1964 was real. 3 North Vietnamese P-4 torpedo boats approached the Maddox. The Maddox fired warning shots. The torpedo boats launched torpedoes and opened fire. The Maddox returned fire, supported by aircraft from the carrier USS Ticonderoga. 1 torpedo boat was damaged. The Maddox sustained a single bullet hole in its superstructure. That incident happened. It's not disputed. The second incident on August 4 is the one that provided the political momentum for the resolution, and the evidence that it actually occurred has been falling apart for 6 decades. If you've ever wondered how a country ends up in a war that nobody can quite explain, this is a good place to start. Within hours of the reported attack, Captain John Herrick, the tactical commander aboard the Maddox, the officer with the most direct knowledge of what happened that night, sent a cable to Pacific Fleet headquarters that should have stopped everything in its tracks. Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and overeager sonar men may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggests complete evaluation before any further action taken. Read that cable one more time. The commanding officer on the scene told his chain of command, in real time, within hours of the alleged attack, that the torpedo reports were probably false, the radar contacts were probably weather artifacts, and nobody on his ship had actually seen an enemy vessel with their own eyes. He recommended a complete evaluation before anyone did anything. His cable arrived in Washington before Johnson went on television. It did not change the administration's course of action. Let that land. The man driving the ship, the person who was supposedly under attack, told Washington it probably didn't happen. Washington went on TV anyway. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, briefing the president, relied primarily on intercepted North Vietnamese communications that appeared to describe an attack in progress. These signals, intercepts, collected by the National Security Agency, became the primary evidence that the August 4 attack had occurred. They were cited in the presidential address. They were presented to Congress. And they drove the vote on the resolution. In 1968, Senator J. William Fulbright convened hearings to re-examine the evidence. McNamara testified again. Fulbright concluded publicly that the administration had misled Congress. McNamara himself, in his 1995 memoir, In Retrospect, acknowledged that the August 4 intelligence was, at best, ambiguous. But the definitive answer waited until 2005. That year, the NSA declassified an internal historical study completed in 2001, but suppressed from public release for 4 years. The study was written by NSA historian Robert Hanyuk. Its title, Skunks, Bogies, Silent Hounds, and the Flying Fish, The Gulf of Tonkin Mystery, 2-4 August 1964. Hanyuk's conclusion was unambiguous. The signals intelligence cited as evidence of the August 4 attack had been deliberately manipulated by NSA analysts. They had cherry-picked intercepts, translated ambiguous Vietnamese communications in the most threatening possible light, misattributed signals from August 2 as if they described events on August 4, and omitted contradictory evidence from the reports provided to policymakers. Not ambiguous intelligence. Fabricated intelligence assembled from real intercepts through selective omission and deliberate misrepresentation to produce the conclusion the administration wanted. If you're wondering whether fabricated is too strong a word, it isn't. That's the NSA's own historian's finding, published in the NSA's own journal, about the NSA's own analysts. They're not accusing someone else. They're accusing themselves. More than 58,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War. Estimates of Vietnamese deaths range from 2 to 3 million. The legal authorization for the entire conflict rested on an event that the government's own signals intelligence agency later determined had almost certainly never occurred. 2 senators voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution on the 7th of August 1964, Wayne Morse of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska. Morse had received a tip from a Pentagon source that the intelligence was questionable. He stood on the Senate floor and called the resolution a historic mistake. Gruening called it a predated declaration of war. They were outvoted 88-2. Both lost their re-election campaigns within a few years. Neither was vindicated in their lifetime. The vindication came in 2005, 41 years after the vote, when the NSA released the Hanyuk report confirming what Captain Herrick had tried to tell Washington on the night it happened. By then, both senators had been dead for decades. Herrick sent his doubts through the chain of command the night it happened. It took 41 years for the chain of command to agree with him. We're near the end now, and the last story is the one that surprises people the most because it's the oldest conspiracy on the list. It sounds the most like fiction, and it was conducted almost entirely in plain sight. During Prohibition, the United States government deliberately poisoned the industrial alcohol supply, knowing that bootleggers were redistilling it for human consumption, and an estimated 10,000 Americans died as a result. I know, that sentence sounds like it can't possibly be true. It is. The story starts with a chemistry problem. When Congress passed the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages effective January 1920, the law included an exemption for industrial alcohol ethanol used in manufacturing, solvents, fuels, pharmaceuticals, and dozens of other non-beverage applications. Industry needed it. But industrial alcohol is, chemically, the same substance as drinking alcohol. Ethanol is ethanol. And bootleggers figured out very quickly that industrial alcohol could be redistilled, processed through additional distillation to strip out the bitter denaturants and sold as beverage-grade liquor. The profit margins were enormous. The redistillation was simple enough to do in a bathtub. By 1926, the diversion of industrial alcohol into the bootleg supply had become a massive problem. An estimated 60 million gallons per year were being diverted. Government chemists estimated that roughly 1/3 of all bootleg liquor consumed in the United States originated as redistilled industrial alcohol. The Treasury Department's solution was not to increase enforcement against the bootleggers. It was not to crack down on the redistillation operations. It was to make the industrial alcohol itself so poisonous that no amount of redistillation could render it safe to drink. In late 1926, the Treasury Department ordered manufacturers of industrial alcohol to add new denaturing formulas to their products. The most toxic variants included methyl alcohol, wood alcohol, which causes blindness, organ failure, and death even in small quantities, along with kerosene, benzene, mercury salts, formaldehyde, chloroform, camphor, and acetone. Deborah Blum, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, whose 2010 book, The Poisoner's Handbook, provides the most comprehensive account of the program, documented the full list of denaturants and their effects on the human body. The government knew that bootleggers were redistilling this alcohol for people to drink. That was the entire point. The operating theory stated explicitly in Treasury Department communications was that if the product stayed lethal after processing, people would stop drinking. The poison was the deterrent. If you're thinking, that can't possibly have been the actual plan, I understand. But it was, and the results were exactly what you'd expect. People did not stop drinking it. They kept drinking because they were addicted, or because they didn't know what was in it, or because the bootleggers assured them it was safe, or because it was prohibition and there was no legal alternative and they just wanted a drink at the end of a long day, and the only drink available was the one that might kill them. The death toll spiked almost immediately. The first mass casualty event came during Christmas 1926, weeks after the new denaturing formulas took effect. On Christmas Day alone, 41 people were admitted to Bellevue Hospital in New York City with acute alcohol poisoning. 8 of them died that day. Over the Christmas weekend, the toll in New York City reached 31 dead. Emergency rooms across the city overflowed with patients who were blind, convulsing, or comatose, all from drinking liquor that had been redistilled from the newly poisoned industrial supply. Merry Christmas from the Treasury Department. New York City's chief medical examiner, Dr. Charles Norris, now recognized as one of the founders of modern forensic toxicology in the United States, began systematically documenting the poisoning deaths. Norris was not a prohibitionist, he was a scientist. And he understood, from the chemical evidence in the bodies on his autopsy tables, exactly what was happening. These people weren't dying from drinking too much. They were dying from methyl alcohol, from heavy metals, from industrial solvents that no bootleg redistillation process could fully remove. Norris and his chief toxicologist, Alexander Gettler, developed new analytical methods specifically to detect the industrial denaturants in the bodies of the dead. Gettler's laboratory at Bellevue became the most advanced forensic toxicology facility in the country, not because the city had invested in it, but because the federal poisoning program was producing a steady stream of cases that demanded analysis more sophisticated than anything that had existed before. Before the new denaturing formulas were introduced, alcohol poisoning deaths in New York City had been running at roughly 700 per year. By 1927, the number jumped to over 1,000. Norris estimated that the federal program was responsible for roughly 10 additional deaths per day in the city alone. 10 a day, in one city, and if you're doing the math, yes, that's every single day for years. The federal government had turned the liquor supply into a slow-motion mass casualty event, and the official position was that the casualties had it coming. On New Year's Day, 1927, Norris described the government's program in a public statement covered by the New York Times. He called it legalized murder. His language was deliberate, and he did not retract it. He was a city government employee, New York's own chief medical examiner, publicly accusing the federal government of deliberately killing American citizens through a calculated program of poisoning. Your government, your citizens. His word for it was murder, and he had the autopsy reports to prove it. Senator Edward Edwards of New Jersey called the program murder by government edict on the Senate floor and introduced legislation to ban the most toxic denaturing formulas. His legislation failed. The politics of prohibition were too entrenched. Representatives from dry states argued that the deaths were the drinkers' own fault. They had chosen to break the law by consuming illegal alcohol. If the poison killed them, that was a consequence of their own criminal behavior, not of government policy. That argument, the government may poison you if you are breaking its rules, and if you die, you brought it on yourself, was the operating principle of federal alcohol enforcement policy for 7 years. Think about whether that argument sounds familiar. Think about whether you've heard versions of it applied to other substances, other laws, other populations. The language changes. The logic doesn't. The poisoning program continued, with its toxic formulas largely unchanged, until Prohibition was repealed by the 21st Amendment in December 1933. Blum estimates the total death toll at approximately 10,000 Americans, between 1,926 and 1,933, 10,000 people, killed by their own government's deliberate policy decision to poison a substance it knew its citizens were consuming, not as an unintended consequence, not as collateral damage from a well-meaning program, as the intended mechanism of law enforcement. The program was not secret in the way that MKUltra and COINTELPRO were secret. It was conducted openly, under Treasury Department authority, and it was reported on in the press of the era. Norris's denunciations were published. Edwards's legislation was debated on the Senate floor. The public knew, in a general sense, that the government was making industrial alcohol more dangerous. But it was treated as an acceptable cost of enforcing the law. The political framework of the era classified drinkers as criminals. Prohibition had the force of a constitutional amendment behind it. And in that framework, the deaths of 10,000 people weren't a scandal. They were a deterrent that failed. If that logic sounds monstrous to you now, remember it sounded perfectly reasonable to a majority of Congress for 7 years. Progress, apparently. 7 programs. 7 operations that were called conspiracy theories by reasonable people, right up until the moment the files were opened, the witnesses testified, and the government itself confirmed what it had done. Tuskegee ran for 40 years, MKUltra ran for 20, COINTELPRO ran for 15, Operation Mockingbird operated for at least 25. Northwoods was proposed and rejected, but stayed classified for 35 years. The Gulf of Tonkin deception held for 41 years before the NSA's own historian debunked it. The federal alcohol poisoning program ran openly for 7 years, while the government argued that the people it was killing deserved it. And every single one of them shared the same 3-act structure. Act 1. Someone inside the government proposes or initiates something that would be considered monstrous if any other institution on earth did it. Act 2. The program runs years, sometimes decades, because the people running it believe they're serving the national interest. The oversight mechanisms either don't exist, don't function, or choose not to look. Act 3. Someone breaks the silence. A whistleblower, a journalist, a box of receipts on the wrong shelf, a group of activists who pick a lock on a field office door while the rest of the country is watching a boxing match. The thread that connects all 7 stories is not that the government is always lying. It's that the mechanisms of accountability are the only things that have ever actually stopped these programs. Congressional oversight, an independent press, the Freedom of Information Act, the willingness of one person to risk everything by speaking up. Those mechanisms and only those mechanisms have ever worked. None of them ended because the institutions running them decided, on their own, that what they were doing was wrong. Every single one ended because someone outside the program forced the truth into the open. The internal mechanisms, the review boards, the oversight committees, the chains of command failed every time. The external mechanisms, a free press, a functioning legal system, and individual courage succeeded. Eventually, sometimes decades late, but they succeeded. Frank Church understood this. In an interview near the end of the committee's work in 1975, he was asked whether the intelligence agencies could be reformed. His answer: the United States government has perfected a technological capability that enables us to monitor the messages that go through the air. That capability at any time could be turned around on the American people, and no American would have any privacy left. Such is the capability to monitor everything: telephone conversations, telegrams. It doesn't matter. There would be no place to hide. He said that, in 1975, before the internet, before email, before cell phones that track your location every second of every day, before mass digital surveillance was a phrase anyone used. He was describing a future he could already see from the evidence his own committee had uncovered, a future that has since arrived. The church died of cancer in 1984, at the age of 59. He didn't live to see the Patriot Act. He didn't live to see the NSA's bulk metadata collection programs, revealed by another whistleblower in another era. He didn't live to see the debates his committee's work was supposed to have settled resurface, unchanged, 40 years later. But the committee's reports remain in the congressional record. The evidence is still there. The 50,000 pages are still there, for anyone willing to read them. The real conspiracy, if there is one worth staying awake for, is not any single program. It is the ordinary human tendency of powerful institutions to operate in secret, to justify their actions as necessary, to classify the evidence, and to resist accountability until accountability is forced upon them by someone who decides that the truth matters more than their career, their comfort, or their safety. That tendency does not require villains. It does not require evil. It requires only the ordinary human conviction that the work you are doing is too important for anyone else to question. That conviction was present in every program we covered tonight. The PHS doctors in Tuskegee believed they were advancing medical science. The CIA officers running MKUltra believed they were winning the Cold War. Hoover believed he was defending the Republic from subversion. The Joint Chiefs who drafted Northwoods believed they were protecting national security. And the Treasury officials who poisoned the alcohol supply believed they were enforcing the law. They were all wrong. And the only reason we know they were wrong is that someone, eventually, told the truth. Not the institution, not the chain of command, not the oversight mechanism that was supposed to be watching. A person, one person who decided that the truth mattered more than the institution's preference for silence. Sleep tight.